What's up, guys? Welcome back to the HVAC Know-It-All podcast. So Jim Bergmann comes at us again with more knowledge. Sometimes it's hard to keep up with Jim because he's got all these numbers in his head and he's studied evacuation so immensely and so in depth that sometimes it's hard to follow. But I think if you get the basic gist of what he's saying, you're going to come out a lot smarter than you were before you listen to it. So if you can, go back and listen to part 1. And then come back and finish it up here on part 2, guys. This is the HVAC Know-It-All podcast. I'm your host, Gary McCreadie. Top contractors across the U.S. only. This one's going to be pretty cool to expand your marketing reach. Property.com is an exclusive network for certified pros. You can get your own custom Property.com webpage for free. You can also get AI-powered reputation management and get some great lead generation and prospecting tools. The Know Before You Go tool is pretty cool. It gives critical homeowner data like how much they've paid on past jobs. Join Property.com's exclusive network now to expand your reach with homeowners across the U.S. Use McCreadie.property.com, so that's MCCREADIE, property.com, to fill out the form to get approved. So that brings us to triple evac. What are your thoughts on that? Because I mean, you talk to the old school techs, they were taught to do it on every single evacuation they pull, but I don't think that's necessary.
It's definitely not necessary anymore. That was when we had single stage vacuum pumps, and single stage vacuum pumps couldn't pull as deep of a vacuum as we can with the 2-stage pumps we have today. And so that was an old process. And if you go back to Carrier was one of the original ones to publish it, you would pull down till you hit 29 inches of mercury visible on your gauge. Again, we're talking pre-micron gauge just about. Then we put it up with nitrogen. You'd wait 15 minutes and then you pull it down again. And well, nitrogen doesn't absorb water. It is a carrier. It would help. So what you did is you pulled your vacuum down. The reason you were waiting 15 minutes is for the moisture and the water and things to warm back up again. So the vapor would become entrained with the nitrogen. And then when you blow the nitrogen out, any water vapor that was in there would be carried out with the nitrogen. And then you pull it down again. What happens if there's any liquid moisture in there, that's going to drop in temperature. And so you'd pull it down as far as you could to get as much moisture as you can out by change of state. Then you'd charge it up with nitrogen. You wait 15 minutes again or longer for that to moisture to liberate and get carried out with the nitrogen. And that was this process. We did it 3 times. Then, final time you pulled it down, that was it. And again, they used a lot of desiccant dryers back then to help really manage the moisture, but it was about getting as much as you can. Today, we're far better off just doing a single evacuation, a single deep draw evacuation down below, a new system south of 100 microns. And doing our decay test then to make sure that we don't have any moisture left in the system. Decay test will show you if you have a moisture issue or a leak. The way you tell on any vacuum gauge is that you time what your rise is overrun. So if I'm going up 16 microns per minute and I test again in minute 2, minute 3, minute 4, minute 5, I keep going up 16, let's say 16 to 17 microns per minute, that's an indicator of a leak. If I go up 16 microns per minute, then 15, then 14, then 10, then 9, and eventually go to 0 microns per minute, that's an indication of my vapor pressure in my system. So that's what we call decay of vacuum. So what we want to make sure of when we isolate the core tool is that as the vacuum rises, that the rise overrun is continually falling off. And then we can determine at the end of our time period what our ultimate vacuum is. And that's sort of what the blue vac is doing automatically. It's just that's how it does its pass fail. It's just determining if it's tailing off or if it's a leak.
So is there a scenario where a triple evacuation would come in handy these days? Like cold temperature, low ambient evacuation would that help at all if you're struggling to pull down?
I always purge with nitrogen. But here's what you got to understand. This is why people sometimes actually think it works. So when you have refrigerant in a system, it can make the gauge act wonky because the gauge is not calibrated for refrigerant. It's calibrated for air or nitrogen. It's calibrated for an air environment, basically, right? And as we're pulling a vacuum, if you think about it, we're eventually getting to nothing. So if you have refrigerant in the system and it's outgassing out of the oil, or you have air in the system, eventually at the end of the day, the micron gauge will read accurately because the refrigerant's gone or the air is gone, and there's effectively nothing in the system to conduct heat energy away from the thermistor on the vacuum gauge to the surrounding walls. And that's how most vacuum gauges work, is they're testing the thermal conductivity of the air surrounding the sensor. As the atmosphere gets pulled away, the thermal conductivity goes down because there's less molecules to transfer heat from the sensor to the surrounding walls. And so when you get refrigerant in a gauge, like if you were to just take your gauge and open up your hose and let a little refrigerant vapor into your gauge, you would see that your micron reading might go to 300 or 600 microns, and the gauge acts weird. And that's because the refrigerant the molecules of refrigerant have a certain thermal conductivity that are conducting them away from the micron gauge that's simulating a pressure that really doesn't exist. So sometimes, like when your vacuum is stuck and you're stuck at like 600, or you're stuck at some weird thing, and you all of a sudden you blow some refrigerant or blow some nitrogen into that system, what you're doing is carrying out those refrigerant molecules and putting in nitrogen molecules, and you're getting rid of that cross-contamination that's making your gauge act strange. And so if you could wait, but a lot of times it's just better just to, put a little nitrogen in, carry the refrigerant out, and then see where your true vacuum is at, and it'll pull down a little faster. And people are thinking, oh, this is triple evacuation. Well, it's not. Triple evacuation actually had a very long wait time. It's a 15-minute wait time, again, for that moisture to warm up, to get entrained in the nitrogen, and then let the nitrogen carry it out. Today, when you see guys do it, they blow a little nitrogen and they put it right back on the vacuum pump again. And that's just literally carrying refrigerant out and making your gauge act more normal, like it's calibrated.
Yeah. No, I've seen this on older systems. I mean, 15-year-old system, you're pulling a vacuum on it, but there's so much refrigerant in the oil, and you're struggling to get below 1,000 microns sometimes. But it's not because you have a moisture issue or you got a leak. It's because there's still refrigerant in that oil. So is that what you would recommend for techs to do in that case, is to break the vacuum and purge a little bit of nitrogen?
If you need to.
Yeah.
I had a system, I put a new heat pump in my place earlier this fall, and I had a leak inside the fitting. It was a non-repairable leak. So I had pulled it down south of 100 microns when I put it in. I took the heat pump out, got a new one, put the new heat pump in, and I had refrigerant flowed through the system and going through the coil and, all this kind of stuff. So I put the new heat pump on, and I was able to pull it south of 100 microns again because I had no moisture in my oil when I did my repair, right? It just depends, like as you're pulling your vacuum, if your vacuum stalls, it's either one of two things. It's either outgassing or a leak. So, if you add a little bit of nitrogen in there and your evacuation improves, well, then you probably had a cross-contaminated refrigerant affecting your gauge reading, and it's just going to, pull down a little bit faster because the nitrogen carried out some of the refrigerant with it. So it's helpful to do. I mean, sometimes like I said, you hit this point where you stall and you're like, what's happening is refrigerant and oil are miscible, meaning they mix. And this is a really good property of the refrigerant because, back on the old R22, R12 days, chlorine was the molecule that carried the oil back to the compressor. And so the refrigerant and the oil bond together, and you have to break those bonds through evacuation, and that takes time. And depending on the oil, like a mineral oil, very easy to break the bonds. A POE oil or some of the newer stuff seems to be much, much harder. And so I've even, watched it in a sight glass where you can see, you're just watching little bubble, little bubble, little bubble as you're evacuating. You see it in the compressor sight glass, and it's just, what do you do? Well, you can shake the compressor and shake up the oil and help, slosh it around. You could add a little heat, turn on the crankcase heater is a very helpful thing to do to get that oil warmed up. That'll decrease your evacuation times. Those are little things. Sometimes I'll take a dead blow hammer and tap the side of the compressor just to slosh it around a little bit and break the surface tension. You'll see the vacuum gauge increase. But it's just until you get that refrigerant out of there, you really can't depend on your vacuum reading because you're in a contaminated atmosphere that the vacuum gauge isn't calibrated for.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I mean, you've given us half an hour of knowledge, so I'd like for you to give us tell the audience what's going on with measureQuick these days, maybe some updates, some advantages that you now have that you didn't have, and why techs might, or companies in general might want to use it for their startup and their troubleshooting and all that, Jim.
Well, I mean, we've had some huge changes in the last year. I mean, the biggest one was we went to a subscription model instead of a pay-per-use model. That has dramatically changed things for us. We have a lot of individual techs now signing up because,
Really?
before I think they were going to the boss and said, hey, I want to use this app. And they're like, how much does it cost? They're like, oh, $5 per system per year. The boss is running the back of the napkin math going, this doesn't make sense. I don't even know how much I'm going to pay for it. No. Well, now it's $49 per month. And they're like, yeah, if you're making money with it, that's fine. Use it. So our individual subscriptions have dramatically increased. And a lot of techs there's two types of techs that use measureQuick. One is guys that really want to diagnose and solve problems and fix everything, because our diagnostics are probably our most used element of measureQuick. And now that we tied in an AI bot, we have AI tools that actually extract the data from the label and profile the system. So it took like the most clunky or cumbersome part of measureQuick out of the equation now, because that profiling makes it a lot easier. And so we have a lot of people that have subscribed for that. And then the other type of tech that uses measureQuick is somebody that really wants to communicate when it's time to do an early retirement or replacement of a unit versus repair, because we have that vital scoring and system scoring, and it communicates a lot better with a customer, especially because there's age and efficiency components into that scoring that might help them better make a decision on when to replace a piece of equipment. Because especially depending on markets we're in, like new home construction, some of this equipment was installed so poorly and it operates so poorly that even though it runs, it doesn't run efficiently, and it may not be worth the investment of making a repair in, because it's just not going to have good longevity. So poor evacuation, non-condensables, copper plating, things like the dog peed on it and destroyed the condenser, who knows what, but it really helps to communicate that. So we have techs across the board using it for either to help them with sales or to help with service. It was really built around service, but a lot of techs don't like talking to the customer, and it's a lot easier to say, Mrs. Jones, we ran a scan on your system, and here's what the results are, and here's the recommendation that I would make.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of techs, it helps them understand that better.
No, I like that for sure, because service is where my heart is. I don't really like install. I actually hate it, to be honest with you. But service, I genuinely love service. And the thing that bothers me about, especially in the residential market, is we have technicians that don't know how to service equipment. And it seems like the slightest issue, you hear horror stories all over North America about this, is like, it's just, okay, you need a new unit. And it's always, you need a new unit. I was working with a guy last week who was a friend of mine, residential company, who wants me to do some commercial work with him. And there's a company locally that got bought out by a larger company. And one of the scams they're running is, yeah, you need a new capacitor. It's $900, but it's a month out. So we can change your system tomorrow, though. So this is the kind of stuff that drives me insane. And having a tool like measureQuick that can show exactly what is going on with the system on a performance level is creating an ethical way to create a sale, rather than just like a salesy way to make a sale, if you understand what I'm saying.
Interestingly enough, I saw something this summer that I think is worth noting. I watched a couple companies that are using sales techniques similar to what you're talking about, and that only works for a short amount of time, because if you can't properly install what you just sold, in other words, if the caliber of the technicians at a company is so low that they cannot service equipment, then they also cannot install equipment. And eventually it gets to the point where you are servicing so much of what you sold that you can't sell anymore. And so those companies eventually put themselves in a very compromising position, because all you're focused on is sales and you're not focused on quality of the installation, then you eventually end up just in a warranty nightmare. And Not only that, but you also now damage the relationship with your supplier. Your pricing may not be as good because your warranty issues are too high. So that's a short-term gain, not a long-term play. And we, in some markets, like, you get out in Arizona or you get down in Texas or you get in Vegas, the installations are so horrible initially that I can see where you could justify replacements on a lot of these systems versus repairing them because they were just, nothing's done right. Ductwork's not done right. Undersized returns. Equipment's had a hard life. It's running really hot weather. But that being said, you've got to go in and you got to sort of, tear out all the ductwork, start fresh, get the ducts designed right, get the airflow right, get the charge right, get the evacuation right. So, we're seeing, like, we have a large customer in Arizona. We send them blueback pass fails. Like, they do not allow their technicians to move forward until their evacuation is passed. They do not allow their technician to leave that job unless they have 100% on their measureQuick test. They make sure that their static pressures are below half an inch of static pressure before they leave the job. They got to modify ductwork. They'll modify the supplier return to do so, or add an additional filter grills or whatever they got to do. But they charge top dollar for their stuff, but they also make sure that when they're done, that it's done properly, right? So to me, like, nobody ever complains about a expensive install that's done right. It's when you get an expensive install and you get a poor quality installation, that's when we've wronged everybody in the industry.
Yeah, and the other thing too, I don't know how it's working right now in some of the U.S., but here where I am, us in Ontario, there's a large increase. So water heaters have been rentals for decades, but now we're moving to furnaces, ACs, heat pumps as rentals, and customers are the ones that don't have the upfront capital. They don't have a few $1,000s to spend on the install. They're going for it. They're going for that $150 or $200 a month lease or rental fee for a brand new system. So, I mean, I don't know how that's changing the game a little bit when it comes to sales, but it seems like a lot of people are buying into this.
We're seeing the start of that in the States where people are looking at leasing versus buying. What's interesting is the leasing companies are now requiring measureQuick. It's part of the startup because they're, if they get a poor quality installation, the leasing company gets a poor quality installation, then they're the ones eating the early retirement of the equipment or eating all the maintenance and service they're going to have. So they want to make sure that that equipment's installed properly. And that's where you need a commissioning system. I think it's really interesting when you think about our industry, like, everybody understands that you got to put a CRM in place to measure the effectiveness of your business. But the people that are actually generating the revenue in your company are your service technicians. Everybody else is overhead costs. The only people that are bringing in actual cash to the company are the people that are billing your customer. And so you need to have a system in place. It's just as important as your CRM to have a system in place to make sure that your technicians are finding every opportunity for repair in the field. You don't want them going out and just swapping out a cap. You want them going out there and finding the charge issues, the airflows issues, the ducting issues, other opportunities that are going to generate more revenue per ticket and make that really solve real problems for the client, as well as generate more revenue for the company or potential revenue. Obviously, they can decide whether they want to fix it or not. But if you can't identify the fault, then you have no opportunity to sell the solution. And so just by ensuring that every time your technicians go out, they deploy all 9 probes, that they actually get models and serial numbers, that they actually run the system and make sure that the system's operating properly, it's going to dramatically improve the outcome for the company, either in reduced callbacks or eliminated callbacks or in increased sales, because you're going to find more opportunity. The person you most of the time have to level set is that this is actually the dispatcher, because they're programmed for let's say 5 to 6 calls per day, and now you're going to drop that down to 3 to 4 calls per day, because you're going to find more revenue opportunity on every call, and you're going to make more repairs. You're going to find more problems because you're actually following a process or a system that's going to help you identify them. That's the big mistake. We get in like this rush and we figure, oh my God, I got to get to the next call. I got to get to the next call. So you throw a capacitor in, you charge $300, you run to the next call, and and you haven't really serviced anybody. It's a huge disservice to the customer, to the company. Nobody ends up happy with that, but that seems to be the MO of mostly industry.
Well, dispatchers and rushing service calls is like a whole other topic on its own, because I've been there.
Yeah.
And I mean, when I worked for a company, I stopped rushing. I'm like, no, I'm not leaving until I figure this out, until it's done right. And it takes sometimes a lot of experience and to grow a bit of some confidence in yourself and a harder shell to tell the dispatcher, no, I'm not leaving. But anyway, we'll talk about that another time. But Jim, we've gone 40 minutes. Thank you very much for this. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Good talking to you, Gary.